This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Yes, just to start with, I should say that I think I still have a bit of a hangover from my PhD thesis hand-in. And I must say that I didn't quite have as much time on the preparation of this as maybe I would have liked to. So a lot of this will be quite informal, me showing you slides and sources that I used for one of the chapters in my thesis, and basically talking about it. But I'm sure we can have a good discussion from that. So just to start off with, basically what made me interested in studying London's late 19th century, early 20th century housing in more detail was that I realized that on the one hand, it's actually it's a very popular period of house building in London, and that's from a survey actually among architects where they had to select which one was their most which area has the greatest legacy. And so 53% selected Victorian, showing actually Edwardian houses, but it basically sort of Victorian and Edwardian as one period as the most important period. And it's still, you can also see from the way it's advertised with estate agents and so on, you can see that it still enjoys a great popularity. But at the same time, I found that actually the planning and design of it isn't that well understood. And also actually who those people involved in its design were. There are a lot of suggestions about it and a lot of assumptions about it, which are actually not that well founded, that people somehow believe that it didn't really need design. It was designed by builders themselves without architects. It was designed by just copying from pattern books. So there are all kinds of assumptions about it that really haven't been looked at in a lot of detail. So that's what got me interested in it. So on the one hand, actually a very interesting period of London housing, but those involved in its design haven't really been researched in detail. The other thing is I took a bit of a risk with this paper, but with the title, in that sense that I tried to relate it to a very current issue. I know that, I'm not sure, this might be a little bit problematic in a sense that, so maybe let me just briefly say, localism is something very important in the current planning policy of the current government, but it has actually been important also for previous governments, also for the Labour government, and it's basically, the idea is to make planning more democratic, more with involving more local people into the decisions for planning, and also, which in a way also is the same for the design of housing. And I took a bit of a risk, I'm saying, because of course the case study I'm looking at is 100 years or so earlier, and a lot of the things, of course, you can't translate directly. But at the same time, I think actually there are some really interesting things about it, about this case study, although it's 100 years earlier. Just to say that basically, I think when we see new housing developments nowadays, it's actually really hard to make the planning of housing more democratic or more, because it's either you have the case on top, which this was an award-winning housing development. It looks very, in my opinion, very aesthetic on pictures, but of course the planning of it is very top-down, is decided by one architect that determines everything, and it feels very deterministic. It doesn't. There's no involvement in that sense in the planning side by those actually inhabiting the houses or building the houses, or it's either determined by an architect or by a developer. So I think most of the new housing is like that. And then there are some initiatives like that in the Netherlands, where housing is basically everyone can build their own house any way they want, but which I think also has a downside, because actually there's somehow no coherence in it, and I don't know if I find this sort of a more appealing alternative. I find that's also problematic, where there's sort of no coordination there from a planner, architect, or overall developer. So it's a sort of self-build. So I just want to show these. So these are, of course, two very current examples, and in a way, two extremes. And I think actually, when we look at the Minet Estate, what I found interesting is that it actually gives another version, which I think was very successful in many ways. And so I'll get onto that. So we're now rewinding 100 years earlier. This is actually from Raymond Unwin, Town Planning and Practice. And this is very much how Unwin saw Victorian speculative housing. That it was built in a very uniform way, all basically by getting as many houses as possible into the area, and with not very much regard for the spaces around it, but by simply basically the roads, just positioning the roads any way you like, basically badly planned. And he was very much against this kind of housing, and he says, you can see also in this caption that it was basically determined by bylaws. But actually, what I found certainly with the Minet Estate, but I think you can see that in other Victorian estates as well, is that when you look at the design and planning in detail, it was not as unconsidered as it's often presented. So if we now go on to the Minet Estate, that's a map of it from 1840. So the Minet Estate is located there in Lambeth. Small part of it was part of Camberwell. The main part is in Lambeth. And you can see that this map is from 1840, which shows that at that time it was basically just on the edge of the built-up area of London. This is a map of the estate not long after it was purchased by the estate owner. It was bought by Hughes Minet, and he made his fortune in banking. He is from a Huguenot family that had to emigrate from France, and yes, he made his fortune in banking and retired from it, and then invested his money into buying this estate from Lord Knatchbull, Sir Knatchbull. Some of the roads are still named after Knatchbull. So he bought the estate for originally £4,700. At the time, still largely an agricultural estate, and that map shows the leases that were held and basically what the annual rent for each of these agricultural leases was. This is a plan of the farm building that was on the estate at the time, not far from Camberwell Green. Quite a beautiful drawing, but probably also actually a kind of lease. All these documents were in a way lease drawings to determine what it is you would be part of your lease. So they were sort of legal documents actually. This a map of the estate from 1820, and you can see the estate there in green. This was another part, also a small part that belonged to the estate. And Camberwell new road had just been built, and you can see that the first houses are starting actually to be developed along Camberwell New Road, and in particular on Camberwell Green. And actually, it's quite interesting to see if you go to the area. I found that always, or very often, the older houses are located on the main roads, whereas when you get away from them, that's when they become more Victorian rather than early 19th century. Okay, this is another map of the estate. Again, actually used as a tool by the estate surveyors to keep track of who was leasing which part of the land, and it was also updated in the process. So it's not that easy actually to date that map, but you can see that here in this part, which is outlined in blue, there was a large market garden by Joseph Minet. He pioneered a particular vegetable, but I forgot which vegetable it is. Somewhere in here, if you want to know why. So this was the large market garden there, and you can see on that map that slowly some houses starting to be built along Camberwell New Road, but the main part of the estate is still agricultural. Just to make it a bit easier to understand the history of the estate, it's good to see basically the dynasty of the family. It was bought by. He is the one who emigrated, who had to emigrate from France, and then it was bought by Hughes Minet, and really not much happened on the estate until James Lewis Minet inherited it. And the main phase of development really happened with James Lewis Minet and William Minet. So from the 1870s onwards. So this is William Minet, who was very important for the development. I'll get back to him later. And I think this is quite an interesting image. So this was the family crest of a cat, because apparently that's what it means in French. I guess it's not that relevant for the planning of the housing, but at the same time it shows that how the way the estate was developed was very much, I don't know if you can say patriarchal, but it was very much that the family took quite close ownership and a lot of pride in the development of that estate. And I guess that's reflected also in, for example, this family crest. So these you will find those around the estate. This is a map of the estate, and from 1870, by that time it started to be developed, but of course, you can see on that map that actually London was sort of started growing around it, and they were quite late with, that family was quite late actually with developing their estate. It's not quite clear why that happened. It might be that they simply, it had been in the family for a long time. They were content so far with the income they received from the agricultural leases. But what really prompted the development was that the Dover Railway built a railway line, proposed to build a railway line along the edge of the estate, basically passing through the estate along the edge of it. That's actually from the lease, from the sales agreement with the Dover Railway Company, Chatham and Dover Railway Company. And basically selling the land to them that they needed for constructing the railway line and some associated buildings, and also originally the station, which you can see there. The station today is closed. It's just a garage now. but that was the original station, which was open until the First World War. No, it was sorry. So it was the railway station was really built in the 1870s, really as part of I don't know when it was. The station, the nearest station. In 1862. Camberwell New Road Station was opened, and it was in use until 1916. And now the nearest station is Loughborough Junction, which was opened in 1864. So you can see, so 1862. So that really, in a way, disrupted the current leases, but of course also it made it clear that there was an opportunity for development. And here again, this is a map actually begun in about 1843. Again, a lease map produced by the surveyors who were managing the leases for the estate owner. The name is Drivers. They were large firm of surveyors at the time. And so they were managing the estate. And what's interesting about this map again is that it was begun in 1843. When you look even in the archive reference, it says 1843, but because that's the date that it says there. But actually, when you look at what it shows on the map, a lot of the houses that are on there were only built in 1890. So the map was really used as a tool to keep track of the leases. And actually, this, you can't see this now, this is actually a large map, but if you look closely in there, it would actually say the name of the leaseholder on each of these plots. So it was very interesting, the history of how this estate was developed. It was developed quite slowly. So if we say from 1870, this is really when it started, to 1910, so over a period of 40 years. And that's probably part of what makes it so interesting, that it really grew. It really grew slowly with very distinct different phases. And so the first phase was this one. And this is actually divided, these colors, are actually by the date that these plots were leased. It's not necessarily when it was built, but when those plots were first leased for building. So this was first leased in 1869, and then the next large area that was leased was up here, then this one, and then this was the next part, and these are the buildings that basically date earlier. So it was leased, and this was actually also, this part was the part that was the large market garden. And this park now here is named after Joseph Minet, who was the market gardener here, and often, like, even if you read the history of Minet Fields, it says that that's where he had his market garden, but actually in reality it's not that important. But his market garden wasn't actually on the park. It was actually this area here. Okay, on this map, it actually shows the build dates. So although you can see that this large piece of land was leased to two different builders for building the houses, actually you can see on here that it took quite some time for those houses to be built, and it took actually almost 20 years just for this part of the land to be developed. and really grew slowly in stages. And I think this is a very interesting map to me. So this actually is a map of who the builders were, who built the houses. And referring back to the first slides about how typically now housing developments are built, where you have one builder building the whole area, actually at the time houses were built by lots of different builders, and I think it contributed in a way. It also contributed to the way that area developed. That it was not all done by one company, but actually some very small builders. Some just built, one or two houses. Some sort of whole stretches, and so those were the different builders that leased it. If you see those in grey are sort of, some of them just built one or two, whereas those in colours are actually built several. So the first part of that estate development, which was under James Lewis Minet, he was the owner at that time in 1869 and 1870. It happened like this, that he leased that part of land which had been the market garden. He leased that to these two builders called Parsons and Bamford. But they in turn were actually represented by someone called George Mayhew, who was a solicitor. And it seems like that at that time, in Victorian housing, it was quite common that there wouldn't just be one level of a leaseholder. There'd be several levels, and they would somehow be, sometimes they're very hard to untangle. In this case, so on the actual leasehold contract, it was agreement, it was Parsons and Bamford, but the person really pulling the strings in the background was George Mayhew. And they agreed in that lease to build roads, drainage, houses, and then to actually sublease the plots to other builders. So they didn't intend to build all of them themselves. The finance for that, also arranged by George Mayhew, came from Lady Adela Hutt. And then the person acting as an agent for the freeholder were the drivers, the firm of surveyors, one of the largest firm of surveyors in London at the time. And they basically they drafted the leasehold agreement, but what was interesting, actually, they also designed the houses. It's not clear whether they did it themselves, if they had someone in their firm, or if they appointed an architect for it. It's not clear, but they designed the houses as well. And then, of course, there were those numerous builders which you saw on the other lease, who were basically the sub-lessees, and who built most of the houses. And then there was an estate agent who were based on the estate, basically managing that process. And of course, all of these had an important role to play in developing this part of the estate. And the lease agreement is still there. Unfortunately, the lease maps that were attached to it didn't survive in the archive. And when I was looking at this lease agreement, and I thought, all this, basically, it's just full of legal, legal jargon or so. But when I looked at it closely, actually, I realized that it was actually quite a sophisticated master plan, and even architectural master plan, you might say, for this part of the estate, which had, where there was quite a bit of thought had gone into it, basically how this part of the estate was developed. And so in this lease agreement, basically what was determined was those letters, they actually stand for the type of housing by cost that was to be built on this part of the area. So, and it's quite interesting because, of course, the railway was there, so that wouldn't be very desirable to live right next to the railway. So, yeah, please. All right. Yeah. No. It was okay. Yeah. Okay. Yes, I mean, I think, but of course, I mean, yes, but those people, of course, they would have to deal with, pollution, noise, and so on, living right next to it. And so were the least expensive houses really built for a working class, you might say, and then from there, basically going away from the railway, it was set out so that you would have, the more expensive the houses would get, the further away you would go from the railway. So you can see it in the value of the houses, and then also in the type of the houses. So it started off with sort of terraced housing, and with higher terraced housing here, and then with a semi-detached housing there, and then semi-detached and detached houses, and again of even higher value. And then shops, also interesting, right next to the railway station. Again, quite some thought gone into it. There would, basically this would be the houses with shops, and then also a pub. And so this is just overlaying that same map over what is there today. So in fact, that part of the estate was really built largely according to this, you might say, master plan. Of course, at the time, they would not have thought of it as a master plan. And these are the different house types. So you can see it really was very much determined by size. Probably at the time, what was also an influence on that were probably the house classes, which had only been abolished, I think only 20 years or so earlier, but they might have still influenced that in terms of house types, because the house classes were basically they were set out by taxation, and the sizes were set out by taxation, and they're very much determined that you'd have very distinct sort of house types and sizes. And that was probably still reflected in those. But I think it's astonishing how clearly differently they're set out in these different types. And you can see it here by the size of them, how they slowly get bigger from the house types, how you then have underground accommodation, I guess for servants, for example, and then how again this living in houses like this would have been of even higher status. They're detached, then they get further away from the road, and then this is a completely detached house, whereas that semi-detached. This is maybe actually something quite obvious, but I thought it was quite interesting. They have detailed rental books, rental accounts still there for the estate, and I found it interesting how basically you can see that this is where really the main phase of the development starts, and of course the income, the rental income from leases goes up very quickly, whereas when it was as leased as agricultural land, it was it was quite static. the income. And then you can see a little bit, I think this was a peak of a housing boom in London, and you can see a little dip afterwards, but overall it goes up through the income from leasing the land for housing. And of course this first part of the development of the estate was quite strictly controlled. Although it was built by many different builders, the facade design was determined for them by drivers, by the surveyors. They were basically told that you need to build to this elevation, and that is that part, which is why, although this was built by many different builders, actually the facades more or less look the same. But when you look at the plans closely, so these are from the two plans from that same road for building applications, you can see actually that the builders had some freedom in altering them, as long as they stick to that facade. The other thing was that in the leasehold agreement with Parson and Bamford, there was basically a time, it was phased by a time period. They agreed to build a certain amount of houses per year, but in fact they could never actually build that amount of houses. I think the whole part should have been finished, I think, within 6 to 9 years. In reality it took 20 years, and by the end of it, the solicitor George Mayhew, he filed for bankruptcy, and he couldn't actually fulfill the agreement, the leasehold agreement. He couldn't pay the lease, the amount of the lease that he was meant to pay. Instead, it looks like he actually only passed on simply how much he received from what had actually been built. He probably still made a profit, because what he would do is he would basically divide the overall sum by plots, and he would pay, for example, for one of those leases, he would pay something like £4 to the freeholder but the builder building the house would pay him, say, twice that. So it might be that he still made a profit on it. It's hard to tell, but the fact is that he did go bankrupt after 22 years in 1892, and still not all the houses had been built up. And this is actually one of the streets that was then, because it took so long, you can see that by then those elevations probably look dated, and the builders were allowed to propose their own elevation and to move on from those designs. So this was part of that same plot, but with a completely different design of houses, built in the 1890s. And then there were other parts of the estate built in, again, leased to other builders, going on from that first phase. This was an important builder for the estate, Andrew Macdonald, who built some of the streets. One of the streets actually also named after him. Was quite interesting about the estate that, I mean, some of the streets and so are named after something related to the freeholders. But actually, some of the streets, or for example, also the park, were actually named after basically people working on the estate, which I think does say something about the land, about that family. Of course, they were interested in they had a strong financial interest in this, but there were certainly some philanthropic intentions also about the freeholder family. Again, another road built by Andrew Macdonald, and the designs for that are not there anymore, but there are other designs that where you can see that he actually worked with another architect that was basically designing the houses for him. Again, street built Andrew Macdonald. And this, quite interesting, his son took over the business when Andrew Macdonald died, and was very inexperienced. I think his son was 23 years old, and sort of started designing his own houses, which at the time was a strange style, with somehow these bay windows that go all the way up to the front. Quite unusual facades, actually, in terms of their design. Then with actually balconies here on the first floor, kind of set into the facade, and also interestingly, every pair of houses different from the next one. Again, another road built by Andrew Macdonald. Earlier by the father, and some houses, some of the type A houses constructed by various builders in another road, Flodden Road. And so what was interesting about this, the way it developed the master plan, so this is the booth map of that area from 1899, and of course the intention was, in a way, that you wouldn't just have lower income housing throughout the whole estate, but although it was right next to the railway, in a way they tried to bring up the level of the estate, or the residents and their income levels. They tried to, through intelligent planning, really. And it's actually reflected in the booth map. So you can see that basically the further away you get from the railway, the closer you get to the park. You can see that you basically get from, basically the income levels of the residents go up. You basically go then to middle class, well-to-do. Maybe with the colors it's not that easy to see on this map, but I guess you can sort of see it from the grey. So marked purple as mixed. Then it goes up to fairly comfortable and middle class, well-to-do in those parts. Another thing was that this was the map for the second part of the development of the estate. At that point, William Minet had inherited the estate, and with his new ownership, really the way it was planned completely changed. So one of the things that he did was to introduce this park, and it was donated to the residents, and then actually later donated to the council. So it's a public park. But so on the one hand, it was a philanthropic gesture, and it was probably intended as that. At the same time, it also had a different effect, and that was probably also part of it. It of course changed completely the character of that estate, and in the beginning they had actually the houses that were built first were the lower class houses right next to the railway, and those were really the ones that were popular with the builders and that were taken up, whereas the houses further away, the A-type, B-type houses, it took really long for them to be built. So they had to do something to make this area more appealing to higher class, wealthier tenants. and the park is really what did that. Of course, there are a lot of examples you can see around London where that happened, where you can see that the character of an area changed where it gets closer to the park. You can see it in Bloomsbury Square, for example. No, and that really made this area around it here much more appealing. The other thing that they did in the second phase of development was that this area here, you can see in the map, was an area with lower income groups. And then also this area here was an area with lower income groups. Whereas this area was a more popular, wealthier area. So what they tried to do in that estate was basically this road here has hardly any connection to the area with lower income groups. But they try to relate the estate clearly to this area here to the south, which just simply made it more appealing to the tenants. Yes, I mean, we can discuss later the social implications of that and whether that's politically correct and whether that's a good thing or bad thing. But I'm just now at the moment describing what happened. And this is actually a photo of the area to the south, which was basically a wealthier area. So in the second part of the estate development, William Minet was the freeholder. He actually didn't anymore use the drivers or a surveyor to set out the overall planning of the estate and design of the estate, but instead he directly leased the land to different builders. In some cases, even provided finance for it. Then there was still the main estate surveyor. Initially, it was still the drivers who basically kept account of the leases, kept record of the leases, but later on, actually, William Minet appointed his own estate surveyor, Fred Curtis, who was actually trained as a builder, trained as a builder or carpenter. But he basically he took him on as the estate agent, and really in effect also as the estate surveyor. And what else do we have? And then there were those lessees themselves could basically appoint their own architects and propose their own designs for each of the houses, which was quite a shift from what happened before. You can also see from this that actually William Minet had a much closer interest in the planning of the estate. So he visited at least once a week, and he personally approved, part approved along with Fred Curtis, approved the drawings, and was very interested in basically how the estate development would take shape. This is actually a letter which explains, where Fred Curtis explains to one of the people interested in taking out the lease, that system of what he would need to do, that he would basically need to propose his own design, which would then be approved by William Minet and by the estate surveyor. And that's really what happened in the second part of the estate, the second part of the development of the estate, which was really from 1885 onwards. And here is one of these drawings for two houses built by a builder called G in 1893, and And again, it was the drawing was probably, we don't know exactly who proposed the design. This was possibly done by G himself. But there were other examples. This is other houses built by a builder called Sprague in 1901, possibly designed by Fred Curtis himself. Who certainly signed quite a few of the drawings, also quite a few of the drawings for the blocks of flats that they later on built on the estate. But it's not clear if he just signed them as an approval or if he always designed them himself. But another house built according to that new system by a local architect and surveyor, Henry John Grover. And actually that's another aspect which I guess relates to this theme of localism, was that most of the builders and also architects of the houses were really based locally, which was typical at the time. Of course, is not typical today. Again, a row of houses terrace of houses built by G in 1894. And you would find all kinds of sort of quality of drawings. I mean, you've seen that drawing before, which was clearly produced by a professional architect. Quite a beautiful drawing, quite a beautiful design. And then, of course, you also had drawings like this, where it's not clear who made it, possibly the builder himself, but it doesn't look like someone who is a professional designer or a professional architect. But and you had both of those cases. This again, another pair of houses. This one built in 1903. This one very, very likely actually designed by Fred Curtis. You can see that he signs it here, and it doesn't look like that's a signature for approval, but it's actually his drawing. Again, some other houses probably designed by Fred Curtis. There are some houses on another part of the estate, again built in this new system, but in this case, the builder Peter Arundel actually took on quite a long stretch of houses and appointed his own architect, Ernest Avern. And again, you can see it's very much a professionally designed houses where he sort of tried to actually have a coherent design going through, rather than just a lot of the builders' houses. You would have one of the houses designed and then the others were built in the same way. But with this one, he tried to, in a way, design the whole that whole stretch in one go and sort of give it some variation. And then on the other side of that same road, actually, those were houses again built by Peter Arundel, and then the signature on the drawings is THA. And Peter Arundel, his son, worked with him, Thomas Henry Arundel. So it seems to suggest that was his son basically designed the houses on the other side. What's interesting also about this is that actually there you can see how the estate owner and the estate agent was really acting as also an arbitrator, you might say, or in a way, and approving these designs. And in this case, the estate agent said, actually, we don't want any half timbering there on the gables, and actually also, what else did they sort of disapprove of? I think it's the lintels actually, for some reason. The half timbering kind of makes sense because it was actually part of the area of which was part of the London Building Acts, and at the time half timbering would have needed extra approval from the district surveyor because it was fire risk. So that might have been the reason why he had to take off that half timbering. But then, of course, there was still that timber there. But in any case, you can see that the estate agent was actually really approving those drawings. So in a way, almost performing a controlling role. In a way, like an urban planner, you might say, or of course, he would not have considered himself as that, but certainly there was he provided some coherence, some coordination of the different designs. And then again, some other houses built by Peter Arundel and Sons, again signed by THA, so probably Thomas Henry Arundel. And you find quite a few houses kind of designed in that way, by someone who basically learned how to do drawings and then started designing the houses. And in some cases, actually quite successful results. And again, these houses are quite popular, the ones that I just showed before. In the last part of the building of the estate, on the one hand, William Minet ran out of land to build on. So he started building flats. It might be because he ran out of land that he had to, in a way, increase the density. But at the same time, actually, it's quite unusual in that area to find blocks of flats. At that time, most of the housing was houses. It might be that also what made him decide to build blocks of flats, it was also that, of course, the estate was largely rented after they were built. The other houses were leased, but it was certainly, the estate as a whole certainly was still in the ownership of the freeholder, so he was quite closely involved with it. And of course, if you build flats, he would have to maintain them. If he wanted to rent them out, he'd have to take care of them. So there was much closer involvement, and of course there was a greater financial investment in the beginning. And in this case, the houses basically were all those block of flats were all financed by William Minet himself, and actually built by builders that he set up, called the Cooperative Builders. And Fred Curtis was the builder's manager, and they were, in one way they were actually the builders for the estate, also taking care of maintenance. But at the same time, they would also do jobs outside of the estate. And the idea was, as the name suggests, cooperative builders. There was again a philanthropic. Also, I don't know if you can say socialist agenda also behind it, but in any case, that it was managed by the builders themselves. They would get the proceeds and so on. There must have been an idea like that. So it must be I should say not socialist. I should say it was part of the cooperative, probably part of the cooperative idea, certainly part of that movement. But I can't give you, if you're really interested in that, I can't give you all the details about it, but it is, but yeah. So here you can see some actually quite detailed drawings for those blocks of flats and how they were to be built, all signed by the Minet Estate office and Fred Curtis as the builder's manager. But it's not clear who designed them. It's we don't know. I mean, but it could have been. Fred Curtis could be. They're quite beautiful drawings. But what you can certainly say is that there was a very, very close involvement in their construction from the side of the builder, and a lot of care must have gone into making those, and you can partly see that in the details, I think, as well, which are really quite elaborate and really carefully thought out. These are actually the blocks of flats along the park, and then so there is a number of blocks of flats. I think it was 4 in total, actually. This was the largest one along the park, and then that was actually on the other side of Camberwell New Road, a bit away from the main part of the estate. They look a bit more utilitarian than the first block of flats. And in those drawings, I think, again, you can see those were actually drawings which were then produced by the next estate agent and estate surveyor, Carpenter, who took over from Fred Curtis. And it was actually, this is sort of a design for a new gate. And I think it shows that there was really, yes, of course, on the one hand, his function was, to collect the rents from the different leaseholders and from the tenants, but he also had an important function of actually maintaining the estate and really keeping it in quite a nice place, and you can see that, for example, in projects like that, where they then started to construct some new gates, and again, quite carefully designed down to a small degree of detail. So, and I think in these 2 charts, I just bring them back. Yes, I think you can see that really these 2 different systems in the way the estate was planned. One basically from 1870 to 1885, and then the other one from 1885 to 1910. And the result of these two different systems was really quite different, and you can really see it in the architecture. So if the first part, I'm just going to try to go back to the first part. So the first part of the development was really very controlled and quite uniform, whereas the second part of the estate, it was very much driven by the people building the houses, sometimes by the future tenants future leaseholders who would actually appoint their own architect. But at the same time, there was still the estate surveyor and the landowner. They are kind of coordinating these different bits. So I think if we sort of look at the 2 different housing types in the very beginning, that if you go very back to one of the very first slides, let me see if I can get there. It was really actually, I think, quite a nice. It was none of these 2 extremes. It was not the extreme where it was all determined in a quite top-down way, and it was not that extreme where it was totally uncoordinated, actually. But I think there was actually quite a nice balance where somehow the planning process, it grew slowly, it was managed quite carefully, but at the same time it was not only driven by one developer building all of the houses or one landowner, but it was actually driven partly by those constructing the houses and also by the tenants. Of course, maybe there's something also we can discuss. I didn't really want to be political about this in a sense that, I would say of course, it was a landowner, and it was a very sort of almost, you might say, feudal or type of the way housing was developed, which I guess you can have sort of debates about that, whether that's a sort of socially, maybe that's not the perfect system. But I find it interesting just from a planning perspective of how there was coordination, but at the same time there was actually a lot of involvement and quite a great stake actually in the design of the house, in the planning from the different parties involved.